Hello, and welcome to this Bright Talk session live from the Moscone Center, live here in San Francisco for RSA 2019. Welcome, and thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. Today we will be talking about CISO challenges and tips for a more secure enterprise. I'm looking forward to having a very dynamic and fluid conversation with our panelists who are all experts in their own rights. So without further ado, let us dive right in. Just a reminder, we will be taking live questions from the audience, and hopefully we'll be able to get those answered during this session. So I want to say welcome to my panelists.
Good to be here.
And we're looking forward to this being a more casual conversation. So there's been a lot of talks in the news about CISO challenges and how the reporting structure is paramount to the effectiveness of the CISO role and position. Just wondering, what do you guys feel about that? How do you approach that in your own talks with customers, clients, and organizations?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen to be pretty effective is just understanding what you have and what you're protecting, right? I think what I've seen with the best CISOs is they have a good understanding of what's key to the business and what they need to protect, and that's helped, I think, then for them to be able to go to the board or to the executives and say, okay, hey, this is why we're doing this, right? As opposed to being like, hey, no, you can't do that. You can't go to that website, or you can't do this. I think, just as a best practice, I think that's something that's been effective for some of our customers.
Okay.
Absolutely, and I think the greatest challenge for a CISO is understanding where to start. So the average tenure of a CISO is, 18 months in a job? So it's really on-the-job training. And you got to surround yourself with good people. What I advise CISOs to do when you're coming in is understand the maturity of your organization, because you may come in and think you have a very mature IT organization and find out that certain parts are lacking in almost a shocking way. And so to really understand where you're at in various areas in network security, application security, identity security, and then organizing your priorities around those tasks is key.
So I'll take that maybe an opportunity to introduce myself and my colleagues.
Good.
So my name is Masha, Sedova. I'm the co-founder of a company called Elevate Security, and we focus on security behavior change. So the human element of organizations is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. But before starting Elevate, I had the opportunity of being a security executive at Salesforce. And during my tenure there, the security team reported under many different organizational hierarchies. We reported once to legal and to the CTO, once even to the COO. And what became really fascinating is the priorities within the security team change depending on the leadership structure and the reporting structure. And it's easy to go with the winds of your management. Legal tends to lean compliance, CTO will lead product security. COO actually was the most beneficial to my programs in the human engagement because he also owned HR functions. But I think it's really important that regardless of what your management structure looks like, just take a step back and say, what's the most important for my company's risk perspective? And while your management may influence different types of priorities, you also have to find the truth of what is most important from a risk perspective, because that's ultimately the voice of the true voice, I think, of the CISO.
Right.
Awesome.
I'll introduce myself.
Yeah, great.
So, hi, I'm Masha. I'm Jeff Carpenter. I'm with Crossmatch, and I've been in information security about as long as the term's been around. Before it was network security or infrastructure, and then it all came together under cyber. So, yeah, been good to be here.
Yeah, and I'm Rudolph Araujo. I've been in security for a while as well. Started my career actually doing incident response and forensics work, and did that for a bunch of years. And now focus more on the product side. I'm at a company called Awake Security, which focuses on network traffic analysis.
Awesome. And I'm Terence Jackson. I'm the CISO of Thycotic software. We make privileged access management software, and we're based in Washington, D.C. So just to kind of follow up on the original question, so what are some quick wins a CISO can take to show value to the board?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, understanding the maturity of the different parts of the organization. When we talk to CISOs, they are sometimes shocked at, I come from a deep identity background. They're shocked to find that they're still using static passwords to protect some of their most valuable information. So right there, that's an area that say that we're way behind the curve on that. Other areas though, we may be ahead of the curve. We may be right where they need to be in terms of risk profile, in terms of addressing the risks to the organization. So understanding where they're at on each of those areas and then being able to put together an effective plan to address those.
I had an answer last week, and that a conversation I had last night changed. And my thought that the value that a CISO would present to the board is to show how you stand up against your industry and competitors to understand where you are from at least a competitive model. But someone brought up an analogy to me. It's like, well, as a parent, I don't compare my parenting skills to somebody else. I buckle up my kid's seatbelt because that's what I want to do as a parent.
Right.
And that question's actually been blowing my mind a little bit because should we be benchmarking, or are all of our organizations snowflakes in that we should just do what is right for us? But then how do you communicate what is right to a set of executives who are trying to hold you accountable?
Yeah, that's right.
That's the second half of that question I haven't figured out yet.
Do you have helicopter CISOs?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that brings up an interesting point, right? Because every business is unique. I mean, what puts me out of business is very different than puts you out of business, or if you're a big retailer or what have you. And I think this goes back to, like, there is no one-size-fits-all security program. There's no one-size-fits-all benchmark. And I mean, I think it's a great analogy that that you bring up. I think the other thing is, frankly, spending money, right? Most often the question is, can I spend more money? So if there's ways of having a conversation with an executive that says, hey, we can actually optimize our spend here because some of our security tools maybe aren't being as effective, and this goes back to what you were saying, Jeff. And like I've always found that again, the CISOs that are most effective are the people that can go back and say, hey, I found you a way to save you money, right? Or I found you a way that we can do more with less. So that might be a good way to kind of approach that conversation too.
Agreed. So let's take a question from our online audience, which actually ties into this. The question is, what KPIs are most important for CISOs to measure and track the value of their program in business terms? How can a CISO quantify and measure risk?
Do we have 3 hours for that?
Straight to the point.
Where do we begin?
Yeah, that is a very, very good question. Any thoughts or insights on that? I know, as you mentioned, what's important, from our organization may not be important for your organization, but are there best practices set of KPIs that would be beneficial across all industries, CISOs, no matter whether it's retail, commercial, government?
Yeah, I'll give you one, maybe not so very sexy example, right? Like one of the things that we find is, when we go into customers, we find a lot of times they know of about 40 to 60% of what's actually on their network, right?
Right.
So what sometimes helps, like, it's like, hey, we've got all of this stuff on our network that we didn't even know about, right? And it's not it's one of those ways of quantifying risk without, because everyone wants to know, hey, what's my risk, right? But it's hard to put a number on risk. But if you can say, hey, we've got these users that are maybe unmanaged, or we've got these devices, or we've got a sense for, hey, our passwords haven't, for some of our servers haven't changed in 6 months or 12 months. I think those are, tactical, but much more actionable in a way. So I think packaging some of that is maybe more meaningful than just saying, hey, our risk is at a 72 on 100, which is like, okay, what does that mean?
Right.
I can add this from the perspective of the human element. One of the interesting metrics that I've seen effective CISOs roll this up to their board is, what is my user-generated risk or user-generated incidents, and what am I doing to start reducing those? And so you can start mapping it to cost, because there's cleanup associated with it, as well as your risk debt. How many times am I introducing vulnerability to code? Am I downloading malware through my user base? Am I giving away credentials? And how am I driving that down? And so from a human element, that lens is probably the most important, but there's obviously the asset question of it. There's also remediation time and SLA, which are also really critical. And then there's also this element, this brand damage and exposure, which is much more nebulous and hard to quantify.
I think we're starting to see some of the manifest challenges of the CISO role here. From my perspective, it really all comes down to identity. You can have the best SOC in the world, the best monitoring and threat management, incident response, but if you don't know who's getting on your network, what devices are connecting, and have a high level of assurance, and that can translate into KPIs to the question we're answering here, of who those people are, then you're not going to be able to effectively remediate or address any situation that you face. Right. If it's, if you're not sure who's on your network, who's accessing your applications.
Right, and security is one of those hard things where the absence of an event is a good thing, right?
Right.
So how do you prove that you've been effective when nothing's happening?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's kind of go a little bit deeper into that. We've all heard that employees or humans are the weakest link in security.
Yes.
And you mentioned how big identity plays into that. So what are your thoughts around, are humans really the weakest link as far as employees in the security, the threat vector?
Alas, yes, they are. It's pretty definitively answered.
I totally disagree. But I'll let you.
I'm glad we have a point of view.
Yeah, great.
That's good. So the challenge with the way most enterprise software is accessed today, it's through some type of human interaction. So you have an enrollment, a human chooses a password, or they swipe their finger for a biometric. That's usually user selected. Then you have that individual then replaying essentially that, and then based on yes or no, did the person present the right password, was the right biometric presented, that person gets in, and then there's never another checkpoint along the way to determine whether that's still that person, whether there's been an intercession malware takeover, a man in the middle, a man in the browser. So yeah, from that perspective, if we still allow humans to select their own passwords, we're kind of setting ourselves up for folly here, and we need to get away from that as soon as possible. And Masha, I'm interested in your perspective. How are humans?
None of our technology has ever proven to be 100% foolproof either, right? We're still here learning about new vendors, and so to expect our users to be 100% foolproof is also folly. But I think by just writing off the end user, our employee, as the weakest link, we are leaving so much on the table from our defense perspective. And so I'll tell you an example of where I've seen this play out incredibly well. So by encouraging an employee population to identify risk and report it to the security team, you're essentially building a human intrusion detection system that your technology stack cannot and will never be able to get the nuances of, especially if it's a really targeted spear phishing attack or something your signatures haven't caught up. And it takes one person to report a sophisticated APT or red team attack in order to make a hacker's life living hell, because they have spent months on custom development code, and now all of a sudden that malware is forwarded to the security team, and that is an expensive economic problem that will disincentivize a hacker from continuously going after your organization. Which is not to say that the user will not download the malware, but what happens in the moment when they realize they've made a mistake is they in fact can do what our technology might have missed. And so it really is about layering this and creating a culture in which we recognize great behavior, we clarify the behaviors we want in our employees, and then we reward and recognize our employees when they do excellent work, and showcase when people do excellent actions like reporting, because most people think there's a security team in an ivory tower that's totally got it, and that's what we've been communicating. And I actually think one of the biggest jobs of a CISO is to build that bridge to every employee in every organization and understand that we're all in this together, that security is not something that is added on after the fact. It is part of being a successful brand, company, quality code, whatever the thing is that you put out in the world, and that's everyone's responsibility.
The human firewall.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is, ultimately, if you look at where the threats are going, they're still going to target the humans, right? Because the humans have the intellectual property, they have the knowledge, they have. So, I mean, yes, you could argue, are they the weakest link, are they not the weakest link, but they're definitely the target, right?
Right.
So whatever we can do to kind of enable them, to Masha's point, or through technology, make sure that, we're not enabling them with, because with the problem with passwords, is the problem the human or is the problem the password, right? So I think that's where I think there's a lot of opportunity to really engage. So yeah, I would agree with, I think, what Jeff and Masha said.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is education of the end user. One of the things that I did early on in my tenure, which was roll out gamified security awareness program. We've all, I call it death by PowerPoint.
Yeah.
When you're onboarded,
Yeah.
click, 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 next,
Right.
and you just want to get it done. So one thing we're doing actively is engaging our employee base monthly with this gamified, approach. Do you think efforts like that will, I guess, in the long run, provide more capabilities in educating the end user to detect and report those type of events versus a blinky box that we can put on the network?
Well, from my perspective, I'm not a big fan of security awareness training because lots of studies have shown them to be very ineffective. Where I'd like to go is almost back to our last question here. You have a user that's selecting their own password. We need to take that out of the hands of the user. And we need to introduce things like behavioral analytics, risk-based analytics, so that at every moment when that user is interacting with the network, with the application, we have a sense of, it's called identity assurance, that user is still who they say they are. But it doesn't require that user's direct input to do that, to select a password that can be phished and stolen and replayed and used. So I guess that's kind of where I would start with that question.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think you can see this in your life or with kids or dogs. It's not what people know, it's what people do. We all know about how to create strong passwords. We don't actually do it.
We don't do
so
it?
in the places where technology can come in, great. Like technology should absolutely supersede training and the human element at all costs, but that's not always possible. The thing that behavioral science states, though, is in order for anyone else to do anything differently, we need to care enough to do the thing, and that thing needs to be not too hard. So we can either make something easier or we get to really care about it.
That's right.
So the gamification you're rolling out may actually get people to care in a way that the death by PowerPoint may never have, and that might be great. And I think as long as we're respectful of people's time and intelligence, that's really the crux of it. And working with them as allies, and where possible, I bet they don't like to create long passwords that they have to remember.
Nobody likes
it's
them.
no.
You have 30-character passwords.
Yeah. So it's, if we can all, this is sort of where usable security comes in, right? And how do we actually make everyone's lives easier? Because the employees don't want to get hacked either, right? So it's.
I mean, I think the other thing, this goes back to something we were talking about earlier, right? I've taken my fair share of security awareness training, right? And it's always, don't do this, do that. I don't think there's enough hey, why should you not do that? Humans are intelligent, right? We don't like to be told what to do. Even kids, right? I mean, they don't want, you got to kind of rationalize why. And I think gamification is a way to kind of get that point across. But I still think you've got to explain to people why, why is this important, right? How does this affect us as a business? What are our key assets that you need to be responsible for, just as much as the security team, just as much as the IT team. So I've seen more success when I think companies or organizations have taken that approach rather than the traditional security person who gets up on top and says, no, you should not do that.
Right. Okay.
If I can add one point to that, one of the things that has been really eye-opening for me in explaining to executives about what the risk trade-offs is, an executive of a company or a manager who's not in security understands what it means to not deliver a product on time, right?
Exactly.
They understand velocity, they understand profit, they understand employee retention. They don't understand what happens when a security decision is or isn't made. They don't understand the risk ramifications. And if you can find time to spend on the why a decision is being rolled out, you then empower them to more effectively do that risk trade-off.
That's right.
The oil and gas company have done this incredibly well with safety,
Yep.
and because they were moving so fast, years past, that it was causing deaths. And that became unacceptable, and so they understood where on the risk curve, how fast they could move without introducing issues in safety. And there's a delicate balance that a perfect section of this S curve, if you mapped it, that they reside in, and make sure that they aren't over risky, but they don't move so fast, right, that it jeopardizes. And we need to be doing the same in educating our boards and our executives. Maybe not the frontline engineers, that might be a little bit too much, but the why really gets them to understand the other end of the reality, so they can make more effective trade-offs on a daily basis.
It's not just an authoritarian decision, right? Like, hey, I decided you should not use this website. It's like, hey, here's the rationale. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Agreed. Let's go back to another question from our audience. What tools can CISOs use to influence employees and departments in a way that can create a more security-conscious culture?
Yeah, it's back to the user security awareness training. Yeah. That's a great question. There's a number of really creative tools out there. Some are, like I said, gamification. Some are basic security awareness videos and trainings. Others are, essentially honeypots. And this goes to kind of, do you trust your users, and where do you draw that line on their intelligence and their rights there? A lot of those things just have not proven effective in my view, and I think the best thing that organizations can do is really examine how they're letting their employees onto their networks, and moving away from user-selected passwords to other things like risk-based authentication, combined with biometrics, combined with behavioral things, that you have multiple, and when I say multiple, dozens of different factors that an attacker would have to reproduce effectively in a short time frame to mimic that user and to get onto that network or that application. And that's really where we have to go with this, is taking it out of the hands of the user and making it more automated. So, what do you guys think?
So I quit my day job to start a company that does exactly this, because I was so frustrated with the videos being offered in the space. We're creating a Fitbit for security behavior change, and because I believe it can be measured, it can be impacted, and you can communicate to your executives. But another free resource tool that I love working in the space is the competing security culture framework that helps you map what you think is security culture, as the person asked, and what your executives might think, and gives you some guidance as to how you can start driving your culture in a more effective way as well. So that's something you can type into Google and get that really great resource as well.
I asked a similar question of a CISO for a big retailer who is one of our customers, and he said, nothing works like free pizza. I was like, what does this say more? Like, well, what is free pizza doing? And he said, every time we rolled out a new policy, we would have one of these lunch and learn sessions. People could come in and just understand why. Again, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, but the free pizza was a little bit of like a peace offering, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, I'm not suggesting CISOs have a pizza budget line item, but it again goes to speak to the whole idea of if you treat your users, you treat your employees as equals, as opposed to, hey, I get to define the policy, you get to listen to me. I think you're less likely to have success.
Okay. Yeah. Masha, you mentioned keyword framework. You know, there are many frameworks out there that CISOs. We're looking at NIST, cybersecurity framework. You have the CIS top 20,
ISO 27001.
ISO 27001.
Alphabet soup, right?
Alphabet soup. In your opinion and experience, what are your thoughts on the various frameworks? Do they work, or is it just more, alphabet soup, so to speak?
Yeah. I think if you look at all of these frameworks, they're kind of guiding principles that are basically common sense-ish, right? There's no rocket science necessarily in any of these, and it comes down to just understanding, okay, what do I have? What do I need to protect? who's likely to want to get to those assets, and then do I have the right controls in place to make sure that those adversaries can't get to it? So I mean, I think, look, depending on which vertical you're in, you're regulated slightly differently. You've got to certainly focus on checking the boxes. But again, I think the most effective CISOs that I've worked with, the compliance regulations tend to come afterwards. Right? Basically, it's an automatic byproduct of, hey, we've got an effective security program that does these 17 things or these 90 things, and oh, by the way, yeah, it helps us comply with these regulations too. As opposed to, I think, traditionally it used to be, okay, we're going to be compliance focused, and what ended up happening is you'd be compliant but still end up getting hacked, and then you'd be like, wait a second, what happened here, right? So I guess I like to look at it a little bit backwards, maybe. Which is easy for me to say, right? I mean, if you're the person responsible for compliance, probably not the best answer you were looking for, but right. My 2 cents for what it's worth.
Yeah, I guess I would say I'm generally pro framework, whether it's NIST or US Cyber or ISO 27001, only because the job of a CISO is so unstructured, and having something in place where you have processes, they're defined, they're written down, they're audited, everyone understands where to go to get those, and you're getting at least, I don't know, ahead of the game, but at least you're in the game. And to your point, when it comes time for an audit, when you look at GDPR, and you look at California privacy that's coming up next year, these things don't specifically call out, they're very vague.
Yeah.
And they're intentionally done to be that way. Mm-hmm. But they're made so that no matter what framework you pick, as long as you have a process when the auditors can come in there and they say, okay, let's see your process for how you handle vulnerability management. Let's see how you do change management. And you can pull that out and say, this is what the document we work to. You have a starting point for that.
Yeah, I used to be a hater on compliance until it became the only way people who speak different security languages can understand that you're up to a certain bar. Because my biggest pain point was it's not real security and it's just security theater. But there's a value to it. Like if you don't have a place to start, the frameworks are an excellent guide. And I acknowledge that there's so many small and medium businesses that need so much advice and don't have huge staffs on available to them, and so the NIST framework actually is a great place. It's logical for us, but if you've never done security, it's a great stepping stone to get into this space. And there's so much value because if we follow this, we create common language amongst ourselves, because how you do vulnerability management, how you do it, how I do it, could all be very different, but if we at least have a unifying umbrella, that's incredibly valuable from the business perspective. So, I would, if I were to be starting up a security team or as a CISO and choosing which ones to prioritize, I think I would look at it through the lens of my customers. Like, what's the language that they would resonate? What would mean most for them? And so, maybe, that's probably more valuable than what's the easiest to pass right out of the gate. Yeah.
So this panel is pro framework.
Pro frameworks. Pro frameworks.
So just to kind of piggyback on a part of that response, a lot of the notable hacks often are traced back to lack of patching or identifying vulnerabilities, which I always like to say those should be basic tenets in cybersecurity program. So what part do you think that, patch management and vulnerability management, play in the long-term strategy of preventing breaches?
Yeah, well, obviously a lot.
All of it.
All of it. But it's absolutely critical, and I think that it's pretty obvious. I think we all agree on that. You got to have a good patch management, vulnerability management. I would add one more thing to that. That's change management. Okay. So, but it has to be in place. You have to have the tools, the people trained, and you have to have general awareness that people monitoring the security, alerts as they come up, and creating plans to get those patches in place.
I think part of the challenge, though, I think Equifax might have been a case of this, right? there's so much stuff in your environment. Like you got to know it exists to patch it in the first place, right?
That's right.
So I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked. I think in the Equifax case, they had all of these Apache servers that with this rapid DevOps kind of thing, they didn't even know existed. So I do think there's clearly, not saying don't patch your servers, right? But there's probably stuff that you need to do before that. And the other thing is, like, these days, especially if you think about the insider threat, if you think about non-malware, the attackers are getting smarter and smarter as the defenders are getting smarter, right, about blocking this. So it's not just because you have all your patches installed doesn't mean you won't get breached either. So I think that's the thing that we need to be careful. There's no silver bullet to. I wish it was. Right. I guess none of us would have jobs if that was the case. That was
right.
Yeah. I'd say if you walk the floor now, you're going of RSA, you're going to see all these amazing buzzwords like AI, machine learning, blockchain,
we almost
drones.
got through a whole panel.
No, I won the bingo. I won bingo. But I think the thing that's like the least sexiest thing to say is we have to get back to basics because we haven't mastered that. We should not be introducing AI because we haven't figured out our patching like as an industry, and it's not like the sexiest conversation, but really I would love RSA 2020 to be like back to basics, right? And what does that look like, right?
Sure.
And we haven't figured out the human element, we haven't figured out our patching, we haven't figured out identity. Like, let's start with those. Asset management 101 would be
a building blocks in place,
exactly.
Before we tackle the higher level.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's it. Like, you don't have great patching, you're not going to, like, your vulnerabilities are published on the internet. Like, that's a pretty simple concept to get out there. And so, I went on a tirade and forgot the core question, but yes, I think patching is great.
Awesome. And we have a question from our live audience to kind of follow that up. What technology or solution do you use as the foundation to build or restructure the corporate defense in depth strategy?
I always start with, my area of expertise, which is identity management. So defense in depth there is you have to have multiple ways you assure the identity of that user. So there's always been a debate as to, is the password going to go away? So in other words, if we're here 5 or 10 years from now having the same panel, is the password relegated to history, or is it still something we're using? And what I say is that the password's going away, but not in the way you think it is. So in other words, it gets relegated to a second or a third factor. The first thing is, what do we know about you, Terence, when you're logging into your machine? If we're not quite sure, can we defense in depth and ask you to provide some type of visible authentication, a biometric, a token, a smart card, something that would give us a higher assurance than you are. So right there at the front gate is how we layer that on the identity side. And then one other interesting point with another buzzword, Masha, here it comes, behavioral biometrics.
Oh.
So that may not be a buzzword this year, but it's coming.
Okay.
And the reason why is because, so the Washington Post last week, they had an article, something that I live every day. The way you hold your phone is going to tell your phone that it's you. Because another person can hold it exactly like you, but the algorithm in the phone, the app that's running that, says that's not you. And that's coming to your network logon near you. So that's all I'll say. You guys chime in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the network's been an interesting place with defense in that, you've got, your standard, architecture, right? You've got your firewalls, you've got your DMZ, etc. I mean, again, the reality of it is that the attacker's already on the inside. Like, how is that helping, right? So I do think, understanding, again, not to use a buzzword, right? But there is the ability to learn what is going on and whether that seems typical or atypical, right? Especially because, again, I think increasingly attackers are trying to blend in more and more, right? They'll use your business justified applications, they'll use Microsoft Office, things like that, as opposed to a traditional exploit. How do you detect that other than basically saying, okay, hey, this behavior doesn't fit the pattern or things like that? So I do think there's opportunities for these, buzzwordy technologies. The reality of it, though, is as security vendors, I think what we should be doing is not talking about the AI, but what's the impact, right? I mean, like, what problem does this solve for you as a CISO or for you as an organization? and the AI is a means to an end, right? So I think that it doesn't quite answer the direct question, but I think it speaks to this broader challenge that I think as security professionals in general we have about communicating why security matters and what we're doing to solve that problem.
So we've talked about employees potentially being the weakest link of the human factor. So what actions or behaviors do you wish employees would change, and why?
Yeah. Well, for me, it's easy, but it's not. But it's not the employees that need to change. We need to change our IT security mindset. That says that we need to allow employees to choose their own passwords, which they will necessarily choose the weakest, easiest to remember password, or a security policy that makes it so long and complex that employee or that user has no other alternative other than to write it down. So what we need to do is take that password out of the hands of users, and you can use technologies we have today. Password managers and password vaulting has been around for a long time. So you start there, right? So you take that password and you put it in there so it can replay it to a legacy application. It doesn't have to be webified. But then, how does that employee unlock that? And then that's where that whole conversation, risk-based and behavioral and everything else comes into play. The key word that we're seeing pop up more and more from customers for the first time ever is the term frictionless. They say, we want to take away passwords and we want frictionless authentication. And what does that mean? It's exactly what I talked about there. It's using those tools that are in place and available today to make the user logon seamless and easy, combine it with SSO and federation, and there you have users getting to their apps in a convenient way, but also in a much more secure way.
So I actually think this question is incredibly dependent on many organizations, and it really depends on the lens with which you ask. Like, what behaviors do I want to change? Is it what my board's asking me about? Is it what's really visible? Is it the locking computer screens? No attackers will likely get in that way, but every employee touches that. That's one aspect. My favorite way to really think about decreasing user-centric risk is just looking at, as I mentioned, user-generated incidents, but also the Verizon Data Breach Report is a phenomenal way to assess the ways attackers have in the last year, statistically speaking, gotten in. And if you look yourself up by the industry and say, okay, is it social engineering? Is it malware? Is it hacking? And those should be the behaviors you should really shore up, because that's the defense you're feeding in. If you want to take it a defense that you're trying to attack as your threats are feeding in. But to the second point, if you want to take that one level nuance, I think threat intel would be a phenomenal way to start prioritizing the way you engage your culture and you engage your executives around what you would ask them to focus their attention on. If you see people being hit, like your scientists being hit because of conferences they've been to, great. Like there's your problem set right there, right? So it's nuanced, but I do think it should be addressed from a risk-based lens.
Yeah, I think the question's interesting, right? Because the reality of it is, I could give you a laundry list. I wish they would click on links. I wish they would open attachments. But all of these, the point I think Jeff made earlier, right, have friction associated with them, right? So I guess I don't know. This might be a pipe dream, right? But I wish we wouldn't have to rely on users doing or not doing something, because the reality of it is, no matter how much you tell someone not to do something, they're invariably going to end up doing it, right? And I think so having this belt and suspenders or trust but verify kind of approach is probably the most effective. So again, I'm not really answering the question because I'm not sure how effective telling the user not to do something specific is going to be across any large organization.
Okay, so we've talked about the death of the password, but do you think that the current technology will really support that we have today? You see reports that Microsoft is attempted to kill the password with that technology, Windows Hello and signing in, but I don't know, I'm not a Windows device user per se, but we have users that do it. Windows Hello, as many other solutions, tend to have a lot of hiccups, and they're supposed to be frictionless, but sometimes they cause more friction.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
you know, what do you think? Is the technology, are we ready for that today to really kill the password on the endpoint?
Well, here's the thing. We're not ready for it today, but we need to create the mindset to get there. I'll give you an example. 4 or 5 years ago, if you would have said to somebody, passwords are going away, you would have had people just laughing at you, right? I didn't know that because I did have people laughing at me. No, but now you say it, and people say, okay, I get it, but what's the alternative? So you got to have a story there. You got to have people, processes, and technology in place that I, as a CISO, can then implement in my environment. And I got to start small, because I can't just say, I'm going to take 150 applications in my environment, kiss the password goodbye, and replace it with something else. So where I would say is you start with the things you already have. Most organizations have a password manager, password vault. You start there, right? Start taking the passwords out of the hands of users, right? And then you replace it with what? With stuff we already have today. Risk-based is becoming more prevalent. Multi-factor authentication is essential for your critical applications. Use single sign-on so that you create that user convenience, that frictionless authentication. Users can get to their applications, and then that's the starting point. And then when you're ready for some of these other things, whether they're inherent biometrics like finger, face, voice, or behaviorals that are coming out, like keystroke biometrics, for example, how you type your password tells you more than the actual password itself.
Okay.
So that's the starting point. Again, not focusing just on technology, but creating the mindset in your IT department that, hey, we got to start, new applications come in, we got to start enforcing application security in a different way.
Not to rush you, but we have about 2 minutes left,
Yeah.
so just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you covered that answer well. Yeah, got nothing more to add to that. Yeah.
Great. Good.
Okay, well, we're almost, I guess, at the end of this road. Thank you guys for participating in this panel. Just get you guys to introduce yourselves one more time as we
Sure.
go by.
I'm Jeff Carpenter.
Masha Sedova, co-founder of Elevate Security.
And I'm Rudolph Araujo, and I'm from Awake Security.
All right, I'm Terence Jackson from Thycotic Software, and thank you for joining us for this Bright Talk session live from RSA 2019. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Terence.
Thanks.